Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we're recapping more than a week of happenings at the UN General Assembly in New York. Diplomats from nearly every country in the world are gathered at the United Nations to discuss issues ranging from war in the Middle East to reinforcing the future of multilateralism with the Pact for the Future. This past week featured speeches from world leaders like President Biden, who said in his final speech at the UN General Assembly that, quote, "We are stronger than we think, we are stronger together than alone," end quote. For more on this topic, we speak with Stephanie Fillion, a veteran UN correspondent whose work has appeared in a variety of outlets including Forbes Magazine, Foreign Policy, and CNN, among others. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
So, Freddie, what do we have on the docket today?
So, good morning, Kelly. First, we're going to talk about the escalating tensions between China, the Philippines, and the United States in the South China Sea. And then we're going to delve into recent updates from Israel and Lebanon, where the possibility of a wider regional war has drastically escalated in recent weeks. Finally, we'll turn to our conversation with New York-based UN correspondent Stephanie Fillion about high-level week at this year's UN General Assembly. So, to start off with the tensions in the South China Sea, we'll get right into it with the topic that's been keeping Asia watchers on their toes for a while now: the escalating dispute between China and the Philippines over territorial claims in the South China Sea. There's one place in particular that's drawn recent international attention: the Sierra Madre, a rusting, beached World War II-era ship that's serving as a de facto Philippine military outpost in disputed waters. Tensions over the ship have mounted in recent months, with Chinese military becoming increasingly aggressive in its attempts to get the Philippines and its American allies to back down. Kelly, can you give us a bit of background on why the Sierra Madre has become such a flashpoint, and how is this escalating at the moment?
So the Sierra Madre, as you noted, is just one of the many flashpoints happening in the South China Sea right now. And from here on out, we'll from time to time refer to the South China Sea as the SCS, just to save my breath a little bit. You know, it's one of the major flashpoints, and it's one in the last couple months that people have really been focusing on because of escalating tensions between China and the Philippines over claims in the South China Sea. So we have to kind of go back a little bit and look at what China's doing writ large in the region and why they're doing it. And then we can sort of focus on the Philippines and the Sierra Madre. But basically, China is trying to claim the bulk of the South China Sea as their territorial waters. And they've been doing this since the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, gained control of China in 1949. And they've got this thing called the 9-line map that they push out everywhere to stake their claim in the region. Now, why it's significant is because for most of the past 75 years, Beijing hasn't had the military, naval, or economic power to actually do anything about this. But things have changed more recently as they've expanded their navy and created a lot of smaller ships and things that can harass other countries' vessels in the South China Sea. So why are they doing this? Well, the first thing is that it's a geopolitical desire to expand what they see as their rightful regional hegemony in the region and reclaim what they view as their rightful historical dominance of the area. The second reason is because this is a shipping lifeline, the South China Sea, especially for Beijing. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development estimates that roughly 80% of global trade by volume and 70% by value is transported by sea. And of that, 60% passes through Asia, with most of that going through the South China Sea. So you can see that this is an extremely important region for China and its economic prosperity. So on top of that, the SCS also holds an estimated 11 million barrels of untapped oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So whoever has control of this area has the potential to have control of a lot of energy resources. So that's why they're doing it. So now, what are they doing? Well, they're harassing a lot of different countries from acting and doing what they want to do in what are technically their own territorial waters because China's claiming all of this. But with the Philippines, tensions have escalated dramatically in recent months around the second Thomas Shoal, which is a submerged reef in the eastern Spratly Islands, a group of islands in the South China Sea. And the Chinese Coast Guard is attempting to block delivery of food and water to this Philippine Marine detachment that is aboard the old ship that they have grounded. They grounded it in 1999 to stake a claim to this area. Some Philippine sailors have been injured. Not only that, but beyond the Sierra Madre, the Chinese have been sinking Philippine fishing vessels, robbed them, turned them away from their traditional fishing grounds. And overall, the Chinese have been harassing Philippine shipping and fishing and resupply to the Sierra Madre for a few months now. So, why does this matter for the US? Well, in the starkest terms, it matters because the US has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, and this extends to, quote, armed attacks on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft, including those of its Coast Guard anywhere in the South China Sea. So we've really got to keep an eye on this because anything, it's extremely easy for things like this to get out of hand and create something where you end up having shooting happening between the Chinese and the Filipinos and a high risk of that then continuing to escalate. So this is going to be something that we're going to watch and we're going to keep watching as time goes on.
Is this a test of the United States' presence or clout in the South China Sea? Is that what China's going for?
Well, I think it's always part of that, right? They're pushing back against what they can get away with and what they can't get away with. And there's been some interesting articles in War on the Rocks, which we can link to in the show notes, about what the Chinese are doing specifically with the Philippines, but also how they're acting in a different way towards Vietnam. So it's interesting to look at that and see what they're trying to do here. But they're going to push as far as they think they can. So it's important to note, too, that there's been international arbitration on this through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS for short, that has sided with the Philippines and their claims in the region. Now, the problem is the Chinese aren't listening to that. On the other side of things, the United States hasn't ratified the UNCLOS treaty, so we're not part of it, which we should be. Can't really push on that from like an international law standpoint. So yeah, the Chinese are going to continue to push in this region, and the US is going to continue to do freedom of navigation exercises through these regions to show that these are international waters and that China can't do whatever it wants in these areas that it claims illegally.
So let's finally turn to the rapidly escalating conflict in the Middle East. In the last few weeks, Israel has ramped up strikes against Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militant group that controls much of Lebanon, fueling fears of an all-out regional war. The most recent set of attacks against the group includes detonating booby trap pages and airstrikes that have killed the group's longtime leader, Hassan Nasrallah, and hundreds of civilians. Israel has reportedly moved ground troops into southern Lebanon in what it calls a limited ground incursion. Israel's biggest backer, the United States, have called for calm, but is also supporting the ground offensive with arms and intelligence. Iran has also reportedly been preparing to retaliate with a ballistic missile attack on Israel, according to news outlets on Tuesday morning. Kelly, this is an incredibly fast-moving story, but what can we say about how things might unfold in the coming days?
Yeah, so as we record on late morning Tuesday, October 1st, the Israelis have begun a ground incursion this morning into southern Lebanon, purportedly to clear the area of southern Lebanon of Hezbollah's ability to strike across the border, so that Israelis can move back into northern Israel without the fear of incursions across the border by Hezbollah or missile attacks from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. And just for our listeners' knowledge, as we record this, Iran is launching missile attacks into Israel. So, how did we get here? So, listeners will remember that on Tuesday, September 17th, this all kicked off with a number of pager explosions all across Lebanon that killed 32 people and injured thousands more. And these were pagers tied to Hezbollah operatives. And the following day, there was a series of explosions tied to walkie talkies. But then on Sunday, September 22nd, there were a number of airstrikes across Lebanon by the Israelis. And then the biggest thing to happen, sort of geopolitically, was on Friday, September 27th, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah since 1992, was killed in an airstrike on Hezbollah's central command center in Beirut, leveling a number of apartment buildings in Beirut. So this was a big strike on the leadership of Hezbollah. And now it looks like we have a ground invasion by the Israelis into Lebanon. So, what does all this mean? It means that, this conflict that had been, somewhat tamped down in Gaza is not going away, that the Israelis are using this moment in time to really strike back at what they see as threats to their nation, whether or not that's Hamas or Hezbollah. And we continue to teeter on the edge of this possibility of a wider, more devastating war in the region. It doesn't seem like the Israelis are listening to calls for calm that have been coming from American and other officials over the last few days and weeks. And it doesn't look like, beyond continued calls for calm, that the U.S. is going to take any more drastic measures than it has in the war in Gaza to sort of push the Israelis away from doing anything. So we're just going to have to watch this, fast moving events over the course of the next few days and weeks, but obviously a major escalation of what's been going on in the region.
Yeah, and we remember that after the attempted ballistic strike on Tel Aviv and other places in Israel in April, Biden reportedly said to Netanyahu on the phone, "Take the win." That was the headline back in April. And who knows if Biden will be able to say that again to Israeli political leadership if indeed Iran's ballistic attack this time causes a lot more damage. And it didn't really cause any damage last time. So we wait and see what damage, if any, happens inside Israel as a result of Iran's attack.
So that ends our news roundup. And we now move to our conversation on the United Nations General Assembly with Stephanie Fillion, an international reporter who covers the UN from its headquarters in New York City. Her work has been featured in outlets such as Forbes Magazine, Foreign Policy, CNN, and others. Her UN coverage received 2 UN Correspondent Association awards, as well as a Gracie Award from the Alliance for Women in Media. Let's listen into the conversation. All right, welcome back to this episode of Headlines in History, and I'm excited to be joined by Stephanie Fillion. And Stephanie, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So we have got you here today to talk about the United Nations General Assembly and the big week that we're just coming out of. So can you give us a little bit of background on what exactly High Level Week is and what it means, and a little quick recap of last week at the United Nations General Assembly?
For sure. So the General Assembly is what a lot of people call the Super Bowl of diplomacy. I've called it the Oscars of diplomacy. It's just that week when all of a sudden the UN is relevant and people start caring about it. For us, UN resident correspondent, that doesn't happen very often in the year. But that's also when all the high-level figures, all the presidents, the prime ministers, come out to New York City. Traffic becomes pretty terrible, and we all convene to sort of set the agenda of diplomacy for the year to come, but also, to discuss the most pressing issues of our time, which this year obviously was a very dire year in terms of the geopolitical situation and in terms of diplomacy in general. But I also have to say that this year's High Level Week was a bit different compared to other ones because it started with the Summit of the Future, a meeting that sort of aimed to update the UN charters for it to be a little more fit for the future. So discussing issues that maybe when the UN was created almost 80 years ago were not even issues that people were thinking about. If we think about climate change, if we think about artificial intelligence, the space race, as we're looking at right now. So this year, that's what really kicked it off. And there's always a big summit before the UN General Assembly or UNGA. But I would say that this year, there was really a push or an effort to make a big deal of the UN Summit of the Future. And in a way, it kind of worked because we had over 130 presidents and prime ministers attending the Summit of the Future. So it sort of divided our attention this year between the summit and the high-level debate. It was very interesting because there was a big contrast between what the UN wanted to make out of the Summit of the Future. They were really trying to make a big deal of it, and what we were hearing behind closed doors, which was a lot of frustrated diplomats who thought the Pact of the Future that they ended up adopting was not ambitious enough, and ultimately that it was just a non-binding document that didn't mean much. For us, it was a different week in terms of that because it started with the summit, and then there was the high-level debate where actually some presidents and prime ministers skipped. Some of them decided just to attend the Summit of the Future, but a lot of them spoke at the high-level week.
So you mentioned the Summit of the Future and sort of its reemphasis on trying to reform and create a UN that's more fit for purpose today, more so than it was in 1945. Tied to that, there's a lot of folks within the UN, obviously in countries of the global south, that are rightfully pushing for UN reform. And one of the most recent proposals was a US supported proposal to add 2 permanent seats to the Security Council for African states. Do you think there's any serious talk of that reform or anything moving forward? Or is it just kind of like you were mentioning with some people's disappointment with the Pact for the Future and the Summit for the Future, that it was just more window dressing? Where are we on sort of this bigger issue of Security Council reform and reform in general?
Well, that's a great question. And if I can be completely transparent with you, and I told the same thing actually to some American diplomats as well. I was sitting in the Consular Foreign Relations room when Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield of the United States announced her plan for a new proposal for Security Council reforms. And the first thing I said is, for me, reform of the Security Council is actually the topic that I hate discussing the most at the UN, because that's a topic that's been discussed for decades and a topic that we haven't seen a lot of changes on. So, keeping it short, answering your question very directly, I do believe that it is window dressing, as you just said, because yes, it was important to have it mentioned in the Pact of the Future, because you can't really talk about the future of the UN without addressing the elephant in the room, which is the Security Council is not working. But at the same time, if you have member states like the United States, I think if those are leading the way, and they have to be leading the way because they are the most powerful ones and they are the veto holders and they have to be central to the discussion. But at the same time, I think there is no denying that any proposals they're going to make, none of them will ever get rid of their veto. There have been proposals to not use the veto in cases of crimes of atrocities, crimes against humanity, but all of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council have pretty much all acknowledged that it's not in their interest. They're always going to protect their veto rights. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that what we've seen in the past few years, in the war in Ukraine, in the war of the Middle East, that the biggest problem at the Security Council is for sure the use of the veto. So that's why, for me, and I think for a lot of diplomats as well, current discussions around Security Council reforms is a bit of window dressing, but also a lot of people would argue that adding more permanent members would make the Security Council even more dysfunctional, because then you would just have, depending if you had more vetoes or not, some countries also propose adding more vetoes, and in that case, it would make it even more dysfunctional, and even making it bigger would probably not make it more functional as well. And it's also worth mentioning that while the US is supporting Security Council reforms, we don't really have consensus among the P5, and that's also instrumental in terms of reforming the UN.
Yeah, it's a tough situation because, as you noted already, it's one of the institutions that's in need of reform, the United Nations, but yet there's no visible path on how to move forward for reform that would actually make it happen. We will continue to discuss this, I'm sure. But back to High Level Week. High Level Week outside of UN circles is most famous for the speeches that world leaders make in the middle of the General Assembly. And were there any speeches this past week that stuck out to you at all?
Yeah, many of them. And, I think the biggest challenge for reporters covering UNGA is really to be able to watch the speeches while also covering everything else. But obviously, the one speech that everybody was waiting for and wanted to watch was President Biden's speech, because I think many of us weren't quite sure what to make of his speech before he came, because he is a bit of a lame duck president at the moment, but at the same time, the US is also instrumental on everything that's happening in the Middle East and also in Ukraine. So there was a bit of an ambiguity in terms of how he would approach his last speech at the UN. And personally, I thought that it was an interesting speech, especially in terms of that moment when he stood in front of the General Assembly, and the way that I guess in the PR world, we could call it a spin on, the way that he dropped out of the race, when he was a little bit forced to, but he was able to spin it up by saying, don't hold on to power and think about your people before thinking about yourself. And what I thought was interesting after that, was that the way I read it was a bit of a message for autocrats, but actually it also resonated in other countries. So I'm originally from Canada, and after Biden's speech, I spoke to a few Canadian reporters who told me that they actually asked Justin Trudeau if it resonated with him because he's been in power for almost 10 years now, and he does not show any intent really to give up on the next campaign. So I really thought that was interesting of Biden to say that in front of an international audience. Volodymyr Zelensky's speech was also an important for me. So Zelensky came to New York and he had 3 official speeches to give. So he had the Summit of the Future, he had one in the Security Council, and he had one in the General Assembly. And obviously, Zelensky came to New York kind of desperate for the world to pay more attention to Ukraine. And he came in New York calling for a second peace summit, but also he wanted to bring forward what he calls his victory plan. But what I thought was interesting in Zelensky's speech was the fact that he mentioned by name China and Brazil, because China and Brazil are trying to find another way when it comes to finding a solution for Ukraine. And President Lula's of Brazil's subsequent reaction, where he was not really happy that Zelensky mentioned Brazil by name. So all those dynamics around the future of Ukraine, I guess, maybe help bringing Ukraine a little bit back in the discussions. And then, of course, I cannot not mention Benjamin Netanyahu's quite controversial visit to New York. So there were a few interesting dynamics around that speech. I mean, the speech was not really a surprise because in the past few months, we've seen the Israeli ambassador shred the UN Charter in front of the General Assembly. So we knew that Netanyahu was not going to come to the UN kind of embracing the organization. That was to be expected. So there was no surprise in terms of the content. But a few things that were interesting to me was the Slovenian president who spoke right before Netanyahu used the very last part of his speech to really call on the Israeli government, and I quote him here, to stop the bloodshed. So it was interesting to use that timing right before Netanyahu to do that. And also there was this semi-orchestrated walkout before Netanyahu spoke, which for diplomatic standard is quite unusual because as one expert told me, it's sort of a precedent that a lot of diplomats didn't really want to set because then it can become in the General Assembly, if people walk out every time there's somebody they don't like inside the room, then it can become a little bit messy, like think about India and Pakistan, for example. And then there was also another viral moment, which was quite on the quirkier side. The Haitian president was a little bit thirsty and used the whole pitcher and spilled a little bit of water on himself. And, you know, there was a bit of coverage that was a bit critical because they were mocking him. But I think in a way, it was a bit relatable in terms of, you know, probably just was a little
Hey,
stressed about his speech, was
yeah,
thirsty.
it's happened to the best of us.
Exactly.
Well, now that we mentioned that High Level Week is sort of the one that gets the lights and the cameras and everything and all the attention, but now that the leaders are gone and the General Assembly is still going on, and a lot of the experts normally talk about like this is when the quote sort of like real work happens. So, what are you sort of watching for coming out of the rest of this in the coming weeks? What's kind of on your radar?
Yeah, well, usually the work quiets down right after the UN General Assembly, at least for us reporters. But as we're seeing, the trends right now are going in the opposite direction. So right now, on the General Assembly side, diplomats will convene in committees and get that work going on a more diplomatic level, on a less political level, I want to say. But of course, at the UN right now, there will be, we expect a lot of emergency meetings on the situation in the Middle East. That is significantly escalating right now. And of course, a lot of people were hoping that maybe the high level week could be a way of having significant actors meet around the table and try to find a solution out of it. You saw an attempt between France and the US to call for a ceasefire in Lebanon, and that didn't work. We also saw very strong appeals from foreign ministers of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt for Israel to de-escalate. You saw Jordan also setting a very clear red line for Israel when it came to the West Bank, but unfortunately, we did not really see any result when it comes to concrete de-escalation in the region. So I think that's what's going to keep us busy for the months to come. A lot of people at the United Nations, and we will see if the Security Council is able to do anything at all when it comes to that escalation in the Middle East.
Yeah, unfortunately so. It looks like that's what folks are going to be having to deal with in the coming weeks, as you mentioned. Stephanie, thank you for breaking down the United Nations General Assembly for us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Stephanie for her time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.